This is the videotape deposition of Vicky Halstead, Volume 2. Is it taken by Rodney? Taken by Rodney M. Gaston of the law firm Miller & Zeiss, LLC, in the matter of Kevin Tolson versus St. Agnes Healthcare, Inc., et al. Case number 24-C-12-008-071, filed in the Circuit Court for Baltimore City. The deposition is being held in Minneapolis, Minnesota on April 10th, 2014. The court reporter is Paula Richter, and I am Bob Buckman, the videographer. We are both from the firm of Benchmark Reporting Agency in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We are going on the record at 12:06 p.m. Counsel will now please state their appearance for the record.
Rodney M. Gaston, I represent the plaintiff, Kevin Tolson.
Robert H. Bowles, Jr. on behalf of Dr. Jackson and Quipta Shaw, PA.
Mary Pat McGuire on behalf of defendants Caroline Stell, RN, and St. Agnes Healthcare, Inc.
The reporter will now swear in the witness.
Raise your right hand, please. Do you swear the testimony you're about to give in this matter will be the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Okay,
Wait a minute. Rod, I think it was me who was finishing my questioning when we broke last. So I'm going to set that up and finish my last few questions because that's where we were when the deposition was stopped last time. Ms. Halstead, you were here giving your discovery deposition in this case. I believe it was in January or early February of this year in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and you had already sat through the vast majority of your deposition that was taken by Mr. Gaston on that date. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do, and I believe it was in February.
Okay, thank you. And unfortunately, I was there but was racing to catch a plane, and so we stopped your deposition after Mr. Gaston had completed his questioning, and I was asking a few follow-up questions, but I couldn't complete my follow-up due to my plane. And you were kind enough to stop your deposition at that point and agreed to let us complete it by phone, and that's why you are here today. Is that your understanding?
Yes, that is my understanding.
Okay. I am certainly going to try and limit my questions to just a few to finish my questioning of you. Then Mr. Gaston and Mr. Bowles will have an opportunity to ask you a few follow-up questions if they want to. But this is by no means an opportunity for another complete deposition for you. Is that okay with you?
Certainly.
Okay. I had a feeling that was the case. Okay, so Ms. Halstead, am I correct that you have, after reviewing the medical record from the St. Agnes Hospital emergency department visit of December 3, 2009, pertaining to Kevin Tolson, and after reviewing Mr. Tolson's testimony and the deposition testimony of all his family members, and after reviewing the deposition testimony of Caroline Stell, RN, Anita Weiss, RN, Sharon Craddock, RN, as well as the deposition testimony of the medical providers, Quipta Shaw and Dr. Prudence Jackson, that you have the opinion that you hold to a reasonable degree of nursing probability that Caroline Stell and the nurses at St. Agnes complied with the standards of care in caring for Kevin Tolson on December 3, 2009 in the emergency room. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. And based on all of that testimony and those records that I just identified, Do you have an opinion that you hold with a reasonable degree of medical certainty that Sharon Craddock, the triage nurse, fully complied with the standards of care when she triaged Mr. Tolson on that date?
Yes, my opinion is that she did comply with the standards of care.
You had testified in response to Mr. Gaston that the triage nurse is not required under the standards of care to ask about or determine the mechanism of injury in a patient, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. But you also testified that the triage nurse should ask about the patient's chief complaint and mode of injury. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Do you have Mr. Gaston's deposition exhibit number 5, which is his medical record exhibit, in front of you?
I do.
Okay. Can you turn to page 5 of exhibit 4, which should be the triage record?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Under chief complaint, which is at the top of that record on the second line, do you see that?
Yes.
Okay. Sharon Craddock, the triage nurse, wrote under chief complaint, leg trauma at work. Do you have an opinion that you hold to a reasonable degree of nursing probability as to whether Ms. Craddock's assessment of Mr. Tolson's chief complaint, as written here on page 5 of the record, complied with the standards of care for triage?
Yes, my opinion is that it does comply.
When you testified in the first part of your deposition regarding mode of injury, what does that term, mode of injury, mean to you?
It means basically what caused the injury, such as an injury at work, a car accident, a fall, a pedestrian accident, a burn, etc.
Okay. So in looking at Ms. Craddock's triage assessment, as documented on page 5 of this medical record exhibit, and taking into account her deposition testimony as well, did Ms. Craddock comply with the standards of care in inquiring as to Mr. Tolson's mode of injury when she wrote that he had suffered leg trauma at work, in your opinion?
Yes, that covers the mode of injury and the chief complaint.
Was Ms. Craddock, as the triage nurse, required under the standard of care to determine whether there was a twisting or torquing injury, or whether there was the amount of force or stress or duration of force applied during that injury as part of her triage assessment of Mr. Tolson?
No, that is not required.
Okay. And that's what would be involved in a mechanism of injury type of situation?
Yes.
Okay. One second. There's some noise in the background. Is that you two? Are you speaking?
No.
Okay. Sorry. I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah. No, it's quiet here. That's an echo.
Okay. And with
Is that better?
Yes, it is actually, Bob. Thank you.
Okay.
With respect to Ms. Craddock's triage assessment of Mr. Tolson, including her focused triage assessment of his left leg, do you have an opinion that you hold to a reasonable degree of nursing probability as to whether she complied with the standards of care?
Yes, I feel that she complied with the standards of care.
Okay. All right. And similarly, am I correct that in all respects it is your opinion that Nurse Anita Weiss fully complied with the standards of care in her care and assessment of Mr. Tolson on December 3, 2009?
That is correct.
Okay. And similarly, am I correct that it is your opinion with a reasonable degree of nursing probability that Caroline Stell, RN, fully complied with the standards of care in her care and assessment of Mr. Tolson on December 3, 2009?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. Okay. Now, in reaching your opinions in this case, Ms. Halstead, you took into account all the healthcare provider and Tolson family deposition testimony. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And when you read and took into account the testimony of Kevin Tolson, Corey Elaine Tolson, Marion Tolson, and the rest of the Tolson family members, is it correct that your opinions did not change, that Caroline Stell and the St. Agnes nurses complied with the standards of care in his care?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. I think that there may have been some confusion, and I want to clarify this right now. Did you exclude the family's testimony or Mr. Tolson's testimony for purposes of your opinions that Nurse Stell and the other nurses did not breach the standard of care?
No, I did not.
Okay. So you did take that into account, and still your opinions were unchanged, that the nurses did not breach the standard of care. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. Does that mean that you did not need to exclude or disregard the plaintiff or his family member's testimony that Nurse Stell met the standard of care even at discharge if Mr. Tolson told her at discharge, under the hypotheticals that you had been presented by Mr. Gaston in the first part of your deposition, that he felt like his left foot was cold and that he couldn't feel it? Is that true?
Yes, that is true.
Okay. Am I correct that that Nurse Stell, Caroline Stell, testified that at discharge she touched Mr. Tolson's left leg and foot and did a discharge neurovascular assessment on him?
Yes, that is correct.
And that she, at that time, did not find that he had an objectively cold foot and that he objectively could, in fact, feel her touching him, and therefore, objectively, on her nursing neurovascular assessment, had an intact neurovascular assessment with respect to temperature and sensation, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And did you see that she also testified that Mr. Tolson absolutely had a pulse when she evaluated him at the time of discharge?
Yes.
Okay. You testified also, I believe, in the first part of your testimony that Ms. Krupa Shaw, the physician's assistant, performed and documented in the contemporaneous medical record that she had done a neurovascular examination of Mr. Tolson at discharge after putting him in the knee immobilizer, and that he was neurovascularly intact. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. In, do you have an opinion, Ms. Halstead, as to whether any subjective sensation that Mr. Tolson may have been feeling, according to his testimony and his family members' testimony, that his left foot felt cold to him or that he couldn't feel his left foot, was objectively assessed and evaluated by the nurse at discharge and the PA at discharge, and found that on objective provider assessment and examination, those sensations were not due to some form of neurovascular impairment.
Objection. It was a long, convoluted question.
Did you understand my question, Ms. Halstead?
Yes, you asked me if that is my opinion, and my answer would be yes.
Okay. So, because it was kind of a long question,
Yeah.
let me make sure that we are saying the same thing. Is it your opinion that any subjective complaint made by Mr. Tolson at discharge that his foot felt cold to him or that he couldn't feel his foot was found on objective examination it was found on objective examination by the healthcare providers at discharge that those sensations, such as he may have felt if he did complain of those, were not due to neurovascular impairment?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay.
That's my opinion.
All righty. So I know it is your opinion that Caroline Stell complied with the standard of care when she discharged Mr. Tolson, because you testified to that in your deposition. Is that correct?
Yes, that is.
Okay. So I know that this is not your opinion, but under some of the hypothetical situations that you were presented with in the first part of your deposition, if under Mr. Tolson's hypothetical situation where plaintiffs claim that either Caroline Stell or any of the other nurses failed to tell P.A. Shaw or Dr. Jackson of his complaint that his foot felt cold to him or that he couldn't feel his foot. So I know that's not your opinion as to what happened, but under that situation, that hypothetical situation, if the nurses, any of the nurses, failed to tell Ms. Shaw or Dr. Jackson of a complaint that Mr. Tolson had that his foot felt cold or that he couldn't feel it, do you have an opinion, when you put that in the context of the actual facts of the case, as to whether that affected his care and treatment that he received in the emergency department that day?
Objection goes to causation.
You can answer, ma'am.
Oh, okay. Is there echoing? Is that the problem? Yeah. They're just trying to work on something technical in the room. Okay. So can you just repeat the question briefly, please?
Yes. You were asked a series of hypothetical questions and presented with some hypothetical situations by Mr. Gaston during the first part of your deposition that related to hypothetical situations that if Mr. Tolson told a nurse that his left foot felt cold to him or that he couldn't feel his foot, what the nurse should or shouldn't do. Do you remember those questions generally?
Yes.
Okay.
I do.
So if a nurse, under that hypothetical situation that was presented to you, did not tell Shaw or or Dr. Jackson that Mr. Tolson at discharge had complained that his left foot was cold or that he couldn't feel it. Putting it in the context of what happened in this case, do you have an opinion as to whether that would have affected the care he received when he was in the emergency room that day?
Objection.
If the nurses did not share with the medical providers that he complained of a cold foot and numbness in that foot.
At discharge.
At discharge. That would be, if it was the first time he complained of that, and the nurse determined that there truly is a neurovascular impairment, that would be a breach in the standard of care not to inform the medical providers.
Okay, but that's a little different than what I'm asking, because
Yep.
let me try it a slightly different way, ma'am.
Okay.
You've already testified that Caroline Stell performed a neurovascular assessment at discharge, and that she has testified that, in fact, there was no change. He could feel her touching his foot, and his foot was not objectively cold on her neurovascular assessment. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And you've already testified that P.A. Shaw independently performed a neurovascular examination of Mr. Tolson at discharge and found that he was neurovascularly intact, correct?
Correct.
And that's documented in the medical record, correct?
Correct.
Objection.
And that would indicate that his foot was not objectively cold. There was no neurovascular change in terms of the temperature or the sensation of his foot as found by P.A. Shaw, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And am I correct that Mr. Tolson's testimony, as well as Corey Elaine Tolson's testimony, was that Mr. Tolson had complained or had told both the nurses and the medical providers, that being Shaw or Jackson, that he had had this subjective sensation that his foot had felt numb or that it felt cold to him. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe he told everyone, all the medical staff that, yes.
According to his testimony.
According to his deposition, yes.
Okay. And am I correct that according to Mr. Tolson's testimony and his family members' deposition testimony, that this was not a new complaint or sensation that he was feeling at discharge?
That is correct. It was not a new complaint.
Okay. So if this is not a new complaint at discharge, according to Mr. Tolson's own testimony and the family members' own testimony, and if the nurse has assessed his foot, a neurovascular assessment at discharge, and found him to be intact, and if P.A. Shaw has performed her own neurovascular exam and found it to be intact at discharge, actually, I'm just going to stop there. I'm going to strike that, okay?
Okay.
In your opinion, Caroline Stell, as the discharging nurse, did fully comply with the standards of care, even if Mr. Tolson made a complaint to her at discharge that his foot felt numb to him and cold to him. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. Am I correct that it is your testimony that Nurse Dell and that if Mr. Tolson told Nurse Dell or any other nurse in the ED on December 3, 2009, that his foot felt cold to him and that he couldn't feel his foot, is it your opinion that the nurses complied with the standard of care nonetheless?
Yes, that is my opinion.
Okay. If any of plaintiff's expert witnesses have testified in this case that Nurse Dell or any of the St. Agnes nurses involved in Mr. Tolson's care breached the standard of care if he told them that his foot felt cold to him or that he couldn't feel his foot, is it fair to say that you would disagree with those opinions?
Yes, I disagree with those opinions.
Okay. Then I think that's all the questions that I have. Ms. Halstead, thank you.
You're welcome.
Ms. Halstead,
Yes.
did the counsel share with you the deposition testimony of Dr. Larson?
Dr. Larson. No, I don't believe so.
Wait, that's
Oh,
not
Dr.
true.
Larson. Yes.
She has
Yes,
that
I do have
deposition,
that.
Mr. Justice.
And did you read Dr. Larson's deposition testimony before I took your initial deposition on February the 6th?
Yes.
Okay. And after you read Dr. Larson's deposition testimony, did you inform Ms. McGuire, at least as of February 6th, those portions of his deposition testimony containing opinions that you disagreed with?
Yes.
Objection. You can answer.
Yes, the portions of his testimony I disagreed with were pertaining to the nursing standard of care.
Right. And you informed Ms. McGuire of those opinions that Dr. Larson had that dealt with the nursing standard of care that you disagreed with as of February 6, 2014, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Now, who is the last person that, according to Mr. Tolson's testimony, informed that his foot was cold to the touch and he had no feeling immediately before he was wheeled out of the hospital?
According to his testimony, I believe it was Nurse Dell, although he
Correct.
didn't mention names.
I think you're correct. And that was the nurse who, according to Mr. Tolson and his family, said, "I will let the doctor know of your complaints," correct?
Objection. You are completely mischaracterizing your witness's testimony, and it's being unfairly presented to Ms. Halstead. If you want to direct her to specific testimony, which is
Not
a specific...
examination, and you're not going to interrupt. Ma'am,
Mr. Gaston, I'm telling you that if you are going to ask her to respond to specific testimony, then you need to show her the testimony you're referring to, because there is testimony during all different times of this patient's emergency department stay. So I don't think it's a fair question if you want to just generally put together all these different witnesses' testimony and ask this witness whether she agrees or disagrees or to comment on it in any way. I'm more than happy for her to respond to your questions if you give her specific information that she can respond to.
because you didn't do it during your last half hour of questioning. I'll ask you this question, Ms. Halstead. What is your understanding of Nurse Dell's response, according to Mr. Tolson and his family's testimony, when Mr. Tolson told her, "My foot's cold to the touch and I don't have any feeling in it"?
Objection to the hypothetical.
Are you referring to at discharge?
Right.
Right.
Again, objection to the hypothetical.
According to your hypothetical, my opinion of Nurse Stell at discharge when Mr. Tolson states he complained of a cold and numb foot is that Nurse Stell assessed his foot and did not document that there were any changes according to charting by exception because he had complained of the same subjective symptoms during his entire stay. And she did not inform the doctor of his cold and numb foot complaints because P.A. Shaw had just determined his neurovascular status was normal after she applied the knee immobilizer, as well as Nurse Stell determined that his neurovascular status of his foot was intact at discharge according to her testimony.
Let me go back because I didn't understand your answer.
It was convoluted.
I'm referring to the time when Mr. Tolson is in the examining room and his sister's present. And the person who we believe is Nurse Stell walked into the room. Mr. Tolson told Nurse Stell in the presence of his sister that my foot's cold to the touch and I can't feel my foot. Do you remember that that was Mr. Tolson's testimony?
Yes,
Objection.
I do. Yes.
You can answer, ma'am.
Yeah. Yes, I remember that.
Now, is it your testimony that Nurse Stell did a full and complete reassessment of his foot in the examining room after Mr. Tolson told her his foot was cold to the touch and he had no feeling in his foot?
Now, objection, because you've changed your question, Rodney, because you are now talking about the time sequence based on Corey Elaine's testimony, not based on the testimony at discharge. So with that understanding, Ms. Halstead, you can answer his question, but I don't want you to be confused by that because he's trying to change the time frame on your question.
I'm not trying to change the time frame, and I'm going to ask the question again so everybody's perfectly clear.
Good,
Ms.
thank you.
Halstead, I'm referring to the time that Mr. Tolson is in the examining room. His sister's there with him. Nurse Stell walks into the room, and he tells Nurse Stell, my foot's cold to the touch, and I have no feeling. That's the time we are talking about. Now,
Then I'm going to object because that is not the testimony from Corey Elaine Tolson or Kevin Tolson as you've just presented it then. So you need to direct her to the testimony if you're going to misrepresent it. That is not the testimony at that point in time.
Ma'am, what is your understanding of the time that Mr. Tolson told Nurse Stell his foot was cold to the touch and he had no feeling? When did that occur, and where in the hospital did that occur?
According to whom and when?
I want to know what your understanding is, Ms. Halstead. When is your understanding of when that occurred?
My understanding is that occurred after he returned from X-ray in his emergency department room, and his testimony did not indicate which nurse in particular was in the room. And that, yeah. So I can't.
And what, if anything, did that nurse do in the examination room when Mr. Tolson told that nurse his foot was cold to the touch and he had no feeling? What is your understanding of what that nurse actually did?
According to Mr. Tolson's testimony or according to Corey Elaine Tolson's testimony?
I want to know what Ms. Halstead's understanding is after reading all of the testimony in the case.
Okay.
Well, I'm going to object to the hypothetical. There's not enough facts for her to answer that question, but Ms. Halstead.
There absolutely is. Ms. Halstead, what's your understanding of what that nurse did?
Again, I'm objecting because there's insufficient factual support for that hypothetical.
No, it's exactly what he testified happened. Ms. Halstead, what is your understanding of what that nurse did, if anything?
That nurse
Same
told,
objection.
okay. Is it okay if I answer?
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am,
you
you
can.
can.
Okay. That nurse told the family that she would report that to the doctor, and she left the room, and shortly thereafter a medical practitioner came into the room to examine Mr. Tolson.
What's the identity of the medical practitioner that came into the room after the nurse left?
Objection.
According to the testimony, there was no names. There were no names listed, but it was someone that they thought was a doctor.
Have you been able to determine the identity of this so-called medical practitioner?
No,
Does any of your opinions that you reach in this case, are any of them dependent upon this gentleman being an actual medical practitioner?
Objection to the form, foundation, and hypothetical.
An answer.
what gentleman are you referring to?
The one that we've been talking about, the man that came into the room that you said was a, quote, medical practitioner after the nurse left the room, that gentleman.
Objection, foundation, lack of facts, and an inaccurate restatement of testimony. You can answer.
It's not. You can answer, Ms. Halstead.
I did not say anything about it being a gentleman, and that person has not been identified. It could have been any of the medical staff. But the family's testimony, my understanding from that is that it was someone who they thought was a doctor.
Okay. And could it also have been someone who's not part of the medical staff?
I'm going to object and instruct you that you do not need to answer that question. This is not a case where you are to give opinions or give testimony as to what might have or what could have been.
Yes. Ms. Halstead, is your opinions today based upon the fact this medical practitioner who came into the room after the nurse left was actually a medical personnel at the hospital?
That was my impression, because that person, according to, I believe, Marion, the mother, asked her to step aside so that person could examine his leg.
So, for the opinions that you've given in this case, have you assumed that that person is a doctor, a physician?
Objection. The hypothetical situation that you are drawing on is the testimony of Tori Elaine Tolson and Marion Tolson. Corey Elaine Tolson's testimony is the basis for what you are asking this witness to understand. What does she understand from Corey Elaine's testimony? Corey Elaine herself identified this person as a doctor. So if you want to ask her questions, what her understanding is of Corey Elaine's testimony, she can tell you that. But I am not going to ask this witness to respond to hypothetical situations where you are now saying that her opinion, that you have asked her based on your own witness's testimony, to somehow expound on that and broaden it to her opinions with regard to the whole case. That is completely unfair.
Ma'am, I have a very specific question. Are the opinions in this case that you've given that the nurses did not breach the standard of care, are they based on assuming that the gentleman, this medical provider who walked into Mr. Tolson's room after the nurse left, was a doctor?
Again, I'm objecting to the form and the foundation. It misstates the testimony.
You can answer, ma'am.
No, I do not assume it's a doctor. It could be a physician's assistant or a doctor.
Are you assuming that it was either a physician's assistant or a doctor?
Objection. Same objection.
Yeah. I'm not assuming. I'm not assuming anything.
Well, is your opinions in this case based upon anything that this medical provider did or didn't do when he or she walked into Mr. Tolson's examining room?
Objection.
And my opinion is based on the knowledge that that person was identified as a doctor by the sister, and that person did, according to the family, examine his leg, and that family identified that person as a medical provider.
Would your opinion change if that person was not a medical provider?
Objection. Your opinion is based on your hypothetical situation of your witness, Corioline, and Marion Tolson's testimony. Objection.
Excuse me.
Go ahead, ma'am.
I hate to interrupt for 1 minute. This is the videographer. We have an echo that's coming in, and it seems to be getting worse. So I'd like to go off the record, and I hate to do it at this time, but it's continuing to grow. So I'd like to try to address that, go off the record, address that, and see if we can improve the sound quality.
Go right ahead. Let us know if you have any success.
All right. We are going off the record. The time now is 12:46 p.m. We are back on the record. The time now is 12:50 p.m.
Okay. Ms. Halstead, would your opinions change if a medical person that walked into Mr. Tolson's room was not either a physician's assistant or a physician?
Objection. Foundation form.
Are you referring to the person that examined his leg?
I'm referring to the medical person that came into Mr. Tolson's room after the nurse left and the family mentioned that he, quote, examined his leg. Right. That's the person I'm referring to. Would your opinion change if that person was not either a physician's assistant or a physician?
Again, objection to the hypothetical. No factual foundation or support.
Go ahead.
And according to your hypothetical, no, that would not change my opinion.
Okay. Why would not your opinion change if the person who walked into the room and had examined Mr. Tolson's foot was not a physician's assistant or a physician?
Same objection.
Because my opinion is that the nurse Stell in particular, did not breach the standard of care. She properly assessed Mr. Tolson's leg before ordering x-rays. So that's my original opinion, and that stands.
Okay. I thought your opinion also was, if you accept Mr. Tolson and his sister's testimony, that told the nurse the touch and had no feeling, that it was your opinion that the nurse then had to bring that to the attention of a physician's assistant or a physician. Did I understand your opinion correctly?
If there was change in his foot or neurovascular impairment, yes, the standard of care is that that nurse would bring that to the physician.
Okay, and can you tell me where in the record or in any of the deposition testimony that the nurse who Mr. Tolson and his sister, in his sister's presence, told that his foot was cold to the touch and he had no feeling, where in any of the evidence did that nurse bring his complaint to the attention of a physician's assistant or a physician?
I'm going to object. Again, Rodney, your questions are premised on testimony by Corioline Tolson, his sister. Your questions have been, if you accept her testimony as true, does this affect your opinions in any way? You are now asking her to completely disregard that testimony and creating an entirely new hypothetical where there is absolutely no testimony or evidence to support your hypothetical. So in this situation, I'm going to have to say that Ms. Halstead, you do not need to answer questions for which there is no testimony or evidence to support the basis of his questions. You cannot answer questions that are created out of the blue.
Ma'am, I respectfully disagree with you because there is testimony in this case that Mr. Tolson told the nurse that his foot was cold to the touch and he had no feeling in his foot. So I'm not making this up.
You keep changing the time frame, Mr. Gaston. Your questions in this last group of questions have been based on the time that Corey Elaine Tolson and Marion Tolson testified that they remember hearing Kevin tell a nurse that his foot was cold to the touch and that he couldn't feel his foot. That's what you're referring to. And now you're changing that and saying, so if that's not what was said by them in their testimony, which is the whole basis for you being even able to ask those questions, and then changing that and asking her to respond, that's not right.
I didn't change.
So if you want to give her a specific situation, if you want to read to her something out of somebody's deposition, I'm more than happy for her to respond to you. But I just don't think it's fair what you're trying to do right now.
I didn't change any of the testimony whatsoever. And I
Yes,
want to ask
you
Ms. Halstead this. Ms. Halstead, according to your own recollection after reading the deposition testimony, did you come to the understanding that Mr. Tolson told a nurse in the examining room that his foot was cold to the touch and he had no feeling in his foot?
Objection.
And my answer is he told everyone that came into his room that he
So
had
is that a yes?
that's
According
a
to his testimony.
yeah, according to his testimony, he told everybody that he had a cold foot and numbness in his foot.
Now, if one of those nurses was Nurse Stell, I think you testified that Nurse Stell would have the obligation to make that complaint known to a physician's assistant or a physician. Is that true?
Objection. You have restated her testimony. And again, you are replowing questions that you have already asked her.
She can tell me if I got it wrong. She's got a voice.
Okay, Ms. Halstead, then you have to be very careful and answer the question based on any point in time that these things occurred, according to Mr. Tolson's own testimony. Because I think your answer changes depending on when these things happen. So, you know, which is what you've already testified to.
Go ahead, Ms. Halstead. You can answer my question.
If Nurse Stell heard the complaint from Mr. Tolson that his foot was cold and numb just before P.A. Shaw examined the patient, Nurse Stell was not required to discuss it with P.A. Shaw until she had examined him. And at that point, in many times you collaborate with the doctor. The nurse examines the patient, then the doctor examines the patient, and then you may collaborate with them and discuss, well, what did you find?
And if Mr. Tolson had told Nurse Stell that his foot was cold to the touch and he had no feeling, after he had finished the examination with Nurse Shaw, right before he was ready to be discharged, would then...
P.A. Shaw.
You're right, P.A. Shaw. Would then Nurse Stell have to then report his cold foot and that he had no feeling in his foot to either P.A. Shaw or Dr. Jackson?
Objection asked and answered. You can answer it again, ma'am.
At discharge you're referring to?
Right, after he'd already been seen by P.A. Shaw.
Are you referring to in the early part of his stay or at discharge?
No, ma'am, this is going to go right to before he was wheeled out, okay?
Okay.
Okay, now, if after Mr. Tolson saw P.A. Shaw has approved his discharge, and he's in the examining room waiting to be wheeled out, and he told Nurse Stell at that time that his foot was cold to the touch and he had no feeling, was Nurse Stell required to bring that complaint to either P.A. Shaw's attention or Dr. Jackson's attention?
Objection asked and answered. You can answer it again.
And the answer is no.
Why not?
Because he complained of the same subjective symptoms several times to many different medical staff. That was not a change in his complaint. Therefore, and also Nurse Stell examined the neurovascular status of his foot before he left. And if there would have been an abnormality, she would have contacted the physician before discharging him. That is her testimony that is her practice at discharge.
Now, did you testify when Ms. McGuire was asking you questions earlier today that you took into account the testimony of Kevin Tolson and the testimony of his sister, Corey Elaine Tolson, in rendering opinions in this case?
Yes, I did.
What do you mean by when you say you took that testimony into account?
In forming my opinions, I included all depositions, family and medical staff, and the medical records.
But to what extent, ma'am? How did you take that into account? How did you use that testimony in reaching your opinions? And I'm talking about the testimony of Mr. Tolson and the testimony of his sister, Corey Elaine Tolson.
Objection to form.
So, yeah, you're asking for a process by asking how.
Right. You said you took it into account. I want to know how you used that testimony in reaching your opinion.
Again, objection to form.
In reaching any opinion, I look at all the evidence in the depositions as well as the medical records.
Yeah, but how did you use Mr. Tolson's testimony and his complaints at the hospital to the nurses and the testimony from Miss Corey Elaine Tolson where she said he felt his foot was cold to the touch? How did you incorporate that into your decision-making process to reach an opinion? Did you give it any weight? Did you give it little weight? How did you use that testimony? How did you account for that testimony? That's my question.
Okay.
Objection. Asked and answered. You asked the same question several times in the first part of her deposition, and she fully answered those questions then. So, Ms. Halstead, it's up to you as to whether you want to continue to answer the same question over and over again or whether you just want to say, whatever. It's up to you.
Ma'am, you have to answer my questions, please.
You don't have to answer questions that you've answered before.
It's because you asked her the question today. That's why I'm following up with this question. You asked her whether she took those depositions into account, and I'm following up with that. So, Ms. Halstead, please answer my question.
She did. She said she did.
No, I want to know how she took that into account. How did she use that testimony? You got to explain it to me, please.
You've already answered it, Ms. Halstead, but if you want to answer it again, you can.
Okay, I can simply say that Mr. Tolson's complaint of a cold foot and a numb foot was a subjective complaint that can occur with any type of traumatic injury, but it was not documented objectively by the medical staff that there was any neurovascular impairment of his leg.
So you concluded from the medical provider's examination of his leg that his foot was not cold to the touch?
No,
Objection.
that's not what I said. To him, his foot may very well have felt cold and numb, which can occur when there's a traumatic injury due to several factors. One being that there can be some damage or temporary damage to the nerves in the area. Swelling can cause symptoms such as that. In addition, the ambient effects, it was December, so it was winter, cold outside. He'd had ice on that leg. That foot may have been exposed to the ambient temperature in the room. So there are many factors that can explain that he truly did have, to him, a cold foot and a numb foot.
Okay. Do you believe that Mr. Tolson actually complained to the medical providers who saw him on December 3rd, 2009 in the emergency room that his foot was cold to the touch?
Yes?
Objection.
You can answer.
Yes, I do believe that.
Objection. It's not a question about whether she believes him or disbelieves him. It's a question of whether she considered that testimony in reaching her opinion,
Yes.
which she said she did.
Ma'am, can you answer? Did you believe one way or the other whether Mr. Tolson told the medical providers his foot was cold to the touch? Did you reach any conclusion with respect to that testimony?
Yes, I did believe him. If I did not believe him, I would not have incorporated that into forming my decisions.
Right. And I believe your conclusion was that the medical providers actually considered Mr. Tolson's subjective complaint that his foot was cold to the touch, did their own evaluation, and concluded objectively that it was not cold. Do I have your testimony correct?
Objection. Misstates her testimony.
Yes, that's exactly what you said when you asked her the question. Ma'am, is that your testimony?
Objection. Misstates her testimony.
Does not. Go ahead, ma'am. You can answer.
My testimony is that the medical staff determined that his neurovascular status of his foot and leg was intact.
Does it also mean that you believe they concluded his foot was not cold to the touch?
Objection. You've asked that question and she's answered it at least 4 times. You do not need to answer that question again, Ms. Halstead. You can rely on your testimony.
Ma'am, is there any evidence in the chart that the medical providers actually wrote a complaint from Mr. Tolson that his foot was cold to the touch anywhere in the chart?
P.A. Shaw mentioned, let's see, in her, she's on page, she mentioned that he had paresthesia. And I'm just going to her assessment to be accurate.
I'm talking about anywhere in the chart. Does it reference Tolson made a complaint that his foot was cold to the touch? Is that written anywhere in the medical chart?
Which is what she's answering. Mm-hmm. Ms. Halstead, look at page 11 of Exhibit 4. I think that's what you were just answering.
Yeah. Yeah, page 11 and 12. Mm-hmm.
What's the answer to my question again?
P.A. Shaw said he complained of numbness and paresthesia.
Do you interpret paresthesia to mean that Mr. Tolson's foot was cold to his touch?
No.
Well, back to my question was, I'm trying to figure out if you saw anywhere in the medical chart where a medical provider wrote in the chart that Mr. Tolson complained that his foot was cold to the touch.
No, I do not see that mentioned.
Had made that complaint to any nurse, physician's assistant, or physician, were the nurses or physician assistant or the physician required to make a notation of that complaint in the chart?
I'm going to object. You're now asking her questions that you've already asked her with respect to the nurses. She does not need to answer those again. And now you're asking her questions about what a physician or a physician assistant is required to do under the standard of care. She testified clearly in the first part of her deposition that she was not giving any opinions and would not be testifying as to the standard of care for physicians or physician assistant, Dr. Jackson or Ms. Shaw.
I join in that objection.
You do not need to answer that question again, Ms. Halstead.
Ma'am.
You've already answered it with respect to the nurses.
No, you didn't. Ma'am, if Mr. Tolson made a complaint that his foot was cold to the touch to Nurse Craddock, the triage nurse, was she required to make that notation in the chart?
Objection. You do not need to answer that question. It has already been asked and answered.
Ms. Halstead, are you going to answer the question or not?
No.
Okay, Ms. Halstead, if Mr. Tolson made a complaint to Nurse Weiss, his foot was cold to the touch, was she required to make a notation of that in the chart?
Same objection.
No.
No, she was not?
No, she would be required to either notify a doctor or make her own examination.
Okay. And if Mr. Tolson had informed Nurse Stell that his foot was cold to the top, never mind. If Mr. Tolson had complained to the triage nurse that his foot was numb and he couldn't move it, is the triage nurse required to make a notation of that in the chart?
Again, objection. Rodney, you are now redeposing this witness. You've asked her all of these questions in her first session of deposition when you asked her questions for 2 hours and 40 minutes. This is not the purpose of us finishing today. She's already answered these questions.
You went over ad nauseum for the first half hour, all the breaches of the standard of care, why she didn't believe the nurses breached the standard of care, and I get a chance to go over that again.
Rodney, I did my questioning based on the fact that you have been quite clear in all of these witnesses' depositions that you wanted to hear what if they were going to give an opinion that they had not yet purposefully expressed in deposition. You had not asked her those questions the way I did, and therefore I wanted it to be absolutely clear to you that Nurse Halstead held the opinion that Nurse Weiss and Nurse Craddock and Nurse Stell and any other nurse that saw or took care of Mr. Tolson in the ED did not breach the standard of care, in her opinion. It was an important thing for me to make clear to you because you have been asking each one of these people if they were going to say anything in addition to what they had said to you on your direct questioning. So I was trying to be fair to you. I was not reopening all of this ad nauseum. You are now re-asking questions that you have already fully covered with this witness, and that's not fair.
You did go over all that, so the question stands, Ms. Halstead. If Mr. Tolson reported to Nurse Craddock, the triage nurse, foot was numb, was she required to write that in?
Objection, breadth, lack of time, lack of any kind of factual evidence in which I believe this witness could answer that question.
Go ahead, you can answer.
I'm just not comfortable answering a hypothetical question in this regard.
Well, ma'am, it doesn't really matter if you're uncomfortable answering it. You're an expert. I get to ask hypothetical questions. It's a simple question. If Mr. Tolson had reported to the triage nurse that his foot was numb at the time of triage, was she required to note that in the chart? It's a simple question.
Objection, asked and answered. You do not need to answer that again, but you can if you choose to.
And a lawyer can't tell you not to answer a question. So
Didn't say that.
I'll be cautious. I'll warn you about that. Now go ahead, ma'am. Are you going to answer my question or not?
In a hypothetical, if a patient complained of a foot being numb in triage, that nurse is required to document that or to discuss it with a doctor.
Ma'am, is it your testimony that the triage nurse did not have to make an inquiry of Mr. Tolson as to how he injured his leg at the time of triage?
Objection, asked and answered.
She determined the mode of injury. It was not required of her to determine the mechanism of injury, including all the details of how it happened.
And is it because you believe that another provider along the line would get that information from Mr. Tolson?
Objection.
It's because I believe that the paramedics did inform the triage nurse more details of the mechanism of injury. It's not required that she document that in the chart. But in making her triage decision, she may have taken that into account.
Is your opinion that the triage nurse did not have to document the mechanism of injury, is that supported by any guidelines, by any nurses associations that you're a member of?
Objection, asked and answered.
She documented the mode of injury, and in a triage situation, that is adequate, which
I'm trying
means
to figure
it,
out, are there any written guidelines that support your conclusion that the triage nurse did not have to write the mechanism of injury in Mr. Tolson's chart at the time of triage?
Again, asked and answered several times in several different ways during the main part of your deposition in February.
Go ahead, ma'am, you can answer.
You can choose whether or not you want to answer that question, Ms. Halstead, because you've already answered it.
right.
Not answered to that degree. Go ahead, ma'am.
According to Emergency Nurses Association, all that the triage nurse is required to document in the chart is the chief complaint.
Was Nurse Stell required to remove the splint from Mr. Tolson's leg as part of her assessment?
Objection asked and answered in the deposition starting on February. You can answer again if you choose to.
No, she was not required to move the splint in
Would
order
there have been a breach of the... have removed the splint Tolson's leg as part of her assessment?
I'm sorry. Mr. Gaston, I didn't hear that full question. Can you repeat it?
Would it have been a breach of the standard of nursing care for Nurse Stell to have removed the splint from Mr. Tolson's leg as part of her assessment?
Objection.
Yeah. And the answer is it depends on what type of splint it is.
Tell me, what type of splint would result in a breach of the standard of nurse if Nurse Stell had removed it from Mr. Tolson's leg at the time she did the assessment?
Objection, and I am going to instruct you, ma'am, that you do not need to answer that question. That is completely unrelated to any issue in this case. There has been no allegation by anyone in this case, including plaintiff's own experts, that there was a breach in the standard of care by any nurse caring for Mr. Tolson in failing to or removing the splint. That is absolutely not an issue in this case. And I'm advising you that you do not need to answer that question. I can't tell you not to answer it, but I'm advising you that you do not need to.
Ma'am, you can answer the question.
And I will choose not to answer.
Okay. And as far as I know, you still don't know the type of splint that the paramedics put on Mr. Tolson's leg, correct?
Asked and answered.
And that is correct.
Is the number of interventions that Nurse Craddock considered at the time of triage, is it dependent upon whether or not you suspected Mr. Tolson had a fracture versus a dislocated knee, or would they be the same in your opinion?
Objection asked and answered.
Triage nurse would not be moving a knee around to determine whether it's dislocated or not, first of all.
Okay, and how about the answer to my question?
If it's a fracture versus a dislocation,
Yes, ma'am.
yeah, it depends on what joint you're referring to.
Talking about the knee joint,
The knee
the one
joint.
involved in this case.
If it
I think
was,
that she just answered that
Yeah.
your question doesn't make sense because there's nothing about the nurse that has to determine whether there's a fracture or a dislocation. So I don't know how she can then answer whether that goes into determining the number of resources.
Answered for, but I'm going to ask the question again. Ms. Halstead, was it Nurse Craddock's responsibility to consider whether Mr. Tolson had a fracture of his leg at the time she performed triage?
no,
Was it Nurse Craddock's responsibility to consider whether Mr. Tolson had a knee dislocation at the time she performed his triage?
oh, I thought you said a different word, consider? I thought you said determine,
Consider.
consider. Oh, yes,
Objection. He is objection.
okay.
There is no testimony again, Mr. Gaston, that any nurse is required to consider, meaning consider as in put in a differential diagnosis. That's how you're using this term.
I'm using it
Do
in
not
that
do
fashion,
that.
ma'am. I'm not. And I'm not using the term in that fashion. Don't suggest I am to this witness.
Well, that's how you're going to use it at trial, so it's unfair the way you're posing it.
The question again, Ms. Halstead. Was it Nurse Craddock's responsibility to consider a possible fracture at the time she performed the triage assessment on Mr. Tolson's leg?
Objection.
A triage nurse considers many things in their assessment. And
I understand that.
If
And
you,
my question,
right, if you visibly see a fracture such as a compound fracture where the bone is sticking out of the skin, that is certainly going to change your determination of an ESI number.
in this case, based upon Mr. Tolson's clinical presentation and the history taken, was Nurse Craddock's responsibility to consider a fracture at the time she performed the triage assessment for Mr. Tolson?
Objection.
All that she can determine in triage is that there was swelling or deformity. There's no way she can determine without an x-ray that there was a fracture or dislocation of that
I
knee.
didn't say determine. I didn't mean for her to reach a determination or a conclusion. Want to know if it was her responsibility to consider the fact that he may have sustained a fracture to his leg at the time she performed his triage.
Objection. Asked and answered, and for my other previously stated objections.
And any nurse that's assessing an injury to a leg considers, is there a dislocation or fracture? That's
So is
basic.
that a yes to my question?
Yes.
Okay. Now, and I don't know if I asked this question before, and I apologize if I do, but is the interventions any different whether the nurse has reached a conclusion of a possible fracture versus a possible knee dislocation?
Objection. You just misstated her prior testimony and made it a conclusion or
I'm
a
asking a question.
determination.
Testimony. I asked a question. Ms. Halstead, can you answer my question, please?
The answer is no, that in triage, if Nurse Craddock considered fracture or dislocation of the knee, that would not change her assessment of Mr. Tolson.
Okay. If Nurse Craddock had considered a dislocation of the knee at the time she performed the triage assessment on Mr. Tolson, was she also required to consider the possibility of a vascular injury?
Objection. Rodney, you are completely taking this out of the realm of the scope of nursing practice. And Ms. Halstead, I am encouraging you to consider what the scope of nursing practice is in answering these questions. He is trying to impose obligations on the nurses that are not alleged in this case as having been breached and that do not exist under the scope of the Nurse Practice Act.
I'm absolutely not.
You are.
Ms. Halstead, go ahead and answer my question, please.
Can you ask the question again, Rodney? I need to hear it.
Sure. Was Nurse Craddock required as part of her triage to consider the possibility whether Mr. Tolson sustained a vascular injury to his leg?
Objection for all the reasons just stated.
And my answer is the nurse does not make a diagnosis in triage. The nurse observes that there is swelling, and the nurse knows there's an injury to that leg, and that nurse then assesses the leg distally to the injury as to what the neurovascular status is.
I know the nurse will make a medical diagnosis. My question goes back again. In this case, in light of Mr. Tolson's presentation, was Craddock required to consider that Mr. Tolson sustained a vascular injury to his leg?
asked and answered. You do not need to answer that question again, Ms. Halstead. You just answered it for the 15th time.
Did not. You can't instruct the witness not to answer the question because she didn't answer my question. Ms. Halstead, can I have an answer to my question, please?
Same statement. You've asked and answered it.
And I have answered it, and any ER nurse that's assessing an injury to a leg considers that it could be a dislocation, it could be a fracture. That is in their train of thought, but that nurse does not make that diagnosis.
Right. The fracture.
Where is that noise coming from?
That's from my end. I'm sorry. My head keeps hitting the table. I'm sorry.
Oh, thank you for the humor.
Maybe Ronnie will have mercy on us. On me.
Nurse Halstead, I understand that the triage nurse has to consider a fracture and a dislocation. My question went to the additional of a vascular injury. Would that also be part of the triage nurse's thought process to vascular injury?
Again, asked and answered. She just answered your question on that.
Yes.
Left out the part about the vascular injury.
No, she didn't. She fully answered your question with respect to vascular. Ms. Halstead, you can stand by your prior answers or you can give him the answers again. It is your choice.
As I said, the nurse would check the neurovascular status of that extremity that was injured, which Nurse Craddock did do.
Ma'am, are you aware that a patient can sustain a vascular injury to his legs but still have a palpable in his foot?
Objection. That goes to medical diagnosis. It's a question that should be posed to a medical expert, not to a nursing expert. And I am instructing the witness that she need not answer that.
No, that's beyond the scope of nursing practice.
I believe your testimony was that nurses do not have to check joints in a patient with a suspected knee dislocation in an emergency room setting.
Objection to the foundation of that question. And it's been asked and answered otherwise.
Go ahead, ma'am, you can answer.
Yes, that is correct. Nurses are not required to move joints to assess whether they are dislocated or intact. That's beyond the scope of nursing practice.
Is your opinion supported by any written guideline?
God, Ronnie. Objection. Asked and answered again in the first part of her deposition.
This is a new opinion. I want to know if Ms. Halstead, opinion that you just been is supported by any published written guideline that you're aware of.
Just to be clear with you, Mr. Gaston, you asked Ms. Halstead in several different places in her first deposition whether she was relying on any medical literature or whether there was any written medical literature that supported or with regard to her opinions, and she told you no. And now, and she told you in the first part of her deposition, when you asked her about doing knee exams or whether nurses are to examine the knees for stability, and she told you no. And now you're doing it again.
No, what I'm asking is very...
And I will also add that every one of your medical experts, including your nursing expert, has testified that nurses do not do orthopedic knee exams, knee laxity exams, or assess the stability of a knee. So there is absolutely no basis for you to be even asking this question for a second or third time to this witness.
This is the videographer. I hate to interrupt again, but the echoes has come back quite dramatically again here, so we're getting a lot of echo on this end. What would you like me to do?
Wake up, Bob.
What day is this? What day of deposition are we on?
And what's your name?
Actually, okay, K-12. The echo is not from my end this time for a change.
No, it isn't.
How's that? Is that any better? I decreased the volume on my end.
It seems to be better right now. We'll see what happens.
Of course, now I can't hear you.
What?
It seems to be better.
Okay.
Okay, ma'am, again, for your opinion that a nurse does not have to check joint stability in a person with a suspected dislocated knee, do you know of any written nursing guideline that spells out that opinion or supports that opinion?
Same objections.
Yeah, there's that. My opinion is according to my experience. I did not read any standards of care regarding this prior to my deposition and prior to forming my opinion.
But I'm asking, are you aware if there's any guidelines, written guidelines, to support that opinion you have?
Yeah.
You just asked it. You just answered that.
No, she said she didn't use any and didn't refer any. I want to know if she's aware if there are any. It's a simple question.
Okay.
Same objection.
Yeah, I can answer that. Yes, there are many guidelines from the Emergency Nurses Association in examining an injured leg, and the guidelines are quite generalized. In other words, they're not specific to Mr. Tolson's injury.
But are they specific to your opinion, though?
Objection.
Do you know or not? I just need to know if you know or not.
Yes, I know from my experience and my knowledge of the standards of care for emergency nursing.
Yeah, but I'm talking about the guidelines.
And yes, I'm advanced trauma life support certified. I've been certified in the trauma nursing core course, and yes, there are guidelines through the Emergency Nursing Association generally for assessing an injury to a leg.
And is it your opinion that the triage nurse to write the location of the deformity she noted on Mr. Tolson's leg as to where it was on his leg?
Objection asked and answered specifically in the first deposition. You do not need to re-answer questions, ma'am.
Yep.
Ma'am, does Nurse Stell required to write the location of the deformity on Mr. Tolson's leg that was found by Nurse Craddock?
Objection, foundation, and form.
No, you can answer.
No, because there was no change in his assessment.
So was any of the nurses who examined and assessed Mr. Tolson's physical condition required to write and note in the chart the location of the deformity on his leg?
Objection.
No.
Were they required to write and make a notation in the chart if the deformity was gone or was resolved at any time he was in the hospital?
Objection.
If that's a change in his status, yes.
And would the disappearance of the deformity in Mr. Tolson's leg be a change of his status if that occurred during his stay in the hospital?
Objection. Again, this is not an issue in this case. There is no factual support for what you're saying. There is no evidentiary support, and you are purposefully using vague terminology that can mean many different things and as the basis for your question as to what is considered a deformity. And so I would advise you, Ms. Halstead, not to answer that question. I don't think you have sufficient information in order to answer it.
Your opinion. Ms. Halstead, can you answer my question, please?
Regarding a deformity, that's really beyond the scope of practice of nurses to give details on a deformity. That would be up to the physicians.
But if he didn't have any deformity in his leg discharged, would a nurse be required to note that in the chart?
Objection. Asked and answered, and for the same reasons I just stated on the record.
Go ahead, ma'am.
And I said this in the first deposition, a deformity, something might appear to be deformed to one nurse, and to another nurse it may just be swelling. It's up to the physician to determine if there truly is deformity in that joint or that leg.
Ma'am, before appearing today for your deposition, did you have a chance to review your deposition testimony from February 6, 2014?
Yes, I did.
Was everything you said during that deposition accurate?
Yes.
In fairness, Rodney, we haven't had the errata process on that, so I am going to
Answer the question. Don't assist her with the answer. She can answer it very, very easily. She's read the deposition testimony, and I just want to know if what she said was accurate. So don't assist her with the answer, ma'am. Halstead, please answer my question.
I believe, from what I recall, it's accurate, except for there was a discussion toward the end about the triage time being 15:22, and we don't have a triage time. That was the only thing that I felt was inaccurate.
Okay, thank you very much. That's all the questions I have.
Ms. Halstead, you ready?
Oh, I'm ready.
I have no questions.
Oh, that's cool.
Okay, now Ms. Halstead, this is Ms. McGuire again. You are going to get a copy of your completed deposition transcript. The court reporter will send it to me, and I will send it to you along with something called an errata sheet. And when you get that, I'm going to ask you to please read both sections of your deposition very carefully, and if there are any inaccuracies or corrections that need to be made in the testimony when you have an opportunity to review it very carefully, I'm asking you to please make those changes on the errata sheet and then sign it and send it back to me, and I will provide it to counsel. All right?
All right, I will do that.
Madam Court Reporter, Robert Bowles. I'd like a mini and an E-train, please.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
We are going off the record. The time now is 1:36 p.m.